Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're located. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Um, and we're going to focus today's webinar mostly on crisis management strategies. I'll speak a little bit about different things that we can do in terms of crisis management, uh, things that organizations can do as well um, to set up a crisis management strategy. And I will speak about, finish up with some terms in marketing as to what some organizations are already doing in terms of crisis management, how they responding to the crisis, and some examples that you can obviously use for future reference as well in a couple of videos. Well, without being without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, we already know what's happening around the world, and this is today's data from this morning from the Johns Hopkins University Institute of Medicine here, and we know that we already have over 5 million people contagious with the virus around the world. Some of the most heavily zones hit are the US, Brazil, Russia, and other countries. Obviously, the level of what some countries are doing differs from country to country. But with that being said, let's go ahead and analyze a couple of things already happening around the world. So one of the things that we've seen and it continues to happen is the fact that the crisis, our current crisis right now, which you guys already know, is the COVID-19, has affected the world markets, and obviously that's also having an impact on companies. So the idea behind this webinar is kind of look at some strategies that we can use in here to kind of counteract what's happening. In terms of what's happening around the world in the last few years and the outlook that the World Economic Forum has, there are different factors that can affect companies, can affect countries, can affect our consumers, it can affect us individually as people, right? So we have things such as climate actions, water crisis, extreme weather, and here we have what's happening to us in the last few years, right? The infectious disease piece. In terms of the likelihood of these things taking place, we can see that one of the crises that mostly affect us is the extreme weather conditions, topics related to that, biodiversity, climate action, and obviously that environment continues to change rapidly. We can see that some companies did not adapt quickly enough to some of the crises that they faced in the past, and obviously some of these crises can be financial, can be in terms of what the World Economic Forum showed. And here we have a couple of examples of companies that didn't take crisis seriously, were not able to adapt quickly enough, and we know the faith of most of these companies and what's happening to them in the last few years. That's not to say that companies that are successful right now will not be affected in the near future. And as a matter of fact, Netflix was a company that was having a little bit of an issue before the crisis, and the crisis has actually helped Netflix to continue growing at the pace that it has in the last few years. We know companies like Amazon are also benefiting greatly from what's happening right now, but that's not to say that in the near future, things may not change for these companies as well. Companies that also have entered the market strongly thanks to, in part, for what's happening are Disney Plus and Amazon Prime, which are direct competitors of our Netflix here in terms of their business. Let's talk about change management for a bit, and the things that part of what we do in crisis management and how we reflect and work with this crisis aspect is to embrace, plan, organize, and coordinate the crisis response. And what I'm going to discuss later on here is talking about the crisis area and what we do to kind of fight and work around the crisis. Obviously, trying to do this with as little disruption as possible for the organization and for our consumers as well, internal and external stakeholders. In terms of organizational change, we know that there's a process in here that requires human behavior and performance to be looked at. We know that crisis in itself and the way in which we respond to this can also be an opportunity. And I don't want, the one takeaway that I want from this webinar is that we look at crisis not as something that's always negative, but as something that can help us improve in the way we do things. And obviously that takes a lot of getting used to it. That takes top management organizations to be able to implement strategies to do that. We also need to learn how to work here with our suppliers, customers, even our competitors to be able to bring and create value for our consumers as we manage our crisis. It's not an easy process, right? So managing changes in crisis, some of you guys may have experienced this. It's not easy. Part of it's because we may encounter some resistance from our stakeholders as well, but that's part of what we do in the crisis aspect is manage that. So again, I want you to focus and I want you to look at this as an opportunity. There's always going to be some sort of conflict that arises. That conflict will lead us to some sort of crisis, and obviously that will lead to some sort of change as we implement crisis management strategies in here. For us, the process that we've been have to change in the last few years is adapting to what's happening with the coronavirus, adapting to the new realities of consumer behavior, how our consumers are behaving in the last few years, and in the last few months rather, and obviously how we implement strategies that can help us deal with those changes. So in terms of crisis management and crisis the process or the steps that we look for, we always begin with a pre-implementation process. Obviously, for most of us, the coronavirus was not on the radar to be something that we implemented or added to our SWOT analysis when we started developing strategy for organizations. So this pre-implementation process has been difficult for many organizations. However, that's not to say that we will not be able to obviously deal with this appropriately. There's always going to be some resistance to change from our consumers, from our suppliers, from our stakeholders, internal, external, and we obviously can either look at by ignoring that, preventing it, or the strategy that I always recommend is implement and involve those stakeholders, whether it's internal and external, to be part of the crisis management process. We'll always have an implementation process, and this is kind of what we've seen many organizations right now deal with. They implement strategies to try to deal with what's happening in terms of the crisis, in terms of the coronavirus, in terms of the social distancing, and they're adapting their strategies to be able to encounter and do better things for consumers. Obviously, when we do this, a couple of things need to be taken into account. That is developing a crisis management team that is very cross-functional in terms of the organizations, from top management all the way to the different heads of the organization that can help us develop strategy. So it's not just marketing working alone here or top management, but we got to involve different stakeholders and key players in here that can help us manage the crisis and, of course, find appropriate solutions to what we're doing. Obviously, in a couple of months, once this whole virus thing goes away, luckily in the near future, we need to start looking at post-implementation processes, and that's learning from what we've done, learning from the strategies and activities that got implemented during the implementation process in order to be able to help us develop a new culture, in order to help us deal with this situation that may happen again in the future in a better and more appropriate manner. So in terms of the steps that we implement here, in terms of the organization, everything starts within the organization at the mission and strategy level. That, of course, analyzing what's happening in our environment. And at this point, most of us already know what's happening in our environment. We've been affected by this virus that is taking a toll on how consumers basically buy and do the different things that they do as consumers. And all of this is driving many of the things that we do internally in the organization. Obviously, we need to diagnose, design, and execute plans that will help us deal with the crisis in itself. And we also need to find ways to measure and control some of these activities. So in terms of the crisis management structure, the first things that we start looking at is start managing the crisis as soon as possible. Understand and get everyone's feedback in here, starting by top management. And obviously, we need to develop an emergency response action. Many companies already are doing this, and they're developing ways in which they can start responding to the crisis. One thing that's very key is also listening to our different stakeholders, interpret what's happening to them, and we already know the anxiety that the virus has created in many of our consumers, and also our employees, who many times happen to be our first consumers. We need to be able to prepare and react, which is what we're doing currently, and obviously need to monitor what's happening and monitor what we've done in terms of the reaction process. here's basically what's happening right now, and here's basically what's affecting how we do business, right? And the quarantine and the social distancing has taken a toll on businesses, and we've seen what's happening in the last few years in terms of Main Street and Wall Street. Um, Obviously, we need to adapt to the new realities of how we are reacting as consumers. The social distancing piece, the wearing of our masks, our protective equipment that we have to provide our employees as well in order to do business, to continue the operation and deal with the crisis until a vaccine is actually developed. And all of this, obviously, we have resilience from the organizational point of view, resilience from the individuals, our employees, who can help us implement the crisis management strategy. Change is happening quickly, globally, technology, economic changes. All of these, of course, can represent new opportunities and threats for leaders in the organization, for the organization itself. But obviously, we can find ways to deal with that. All right, and what's to say? Let's look at a couple of crises that taken place in the past, not necessarily pandemic related, but we can see how NASA had a couple of their flights, for lack of a better word, engaged in some activities of crisis here. BP, we know that they had the New Horizon crisis of 2012, and these were opportunities for change and implementation and change for both organizations. Obviously, for NASA, they started working with other partners in order to develop better equipment and better ways to get into space, right? For BP, it took an entire toll in terms of what the company was doing in terms of public relations. And obviously, the crisis of the New Horizon oil spill became a change process for the organization as a whole. All the crises that we've seen and all the organizations have faced, in this case, mostly cities and states, and we can remember what happened in Japan with the earthquake, then turned into tsunami, then turned into a nuclear explosion that devastated the economy of Japan at that point in time. And we cannot forget the crisis of 9/11 that was faced in the US, obviously having also an issue and an impact with economic development in the country. Just so that you guys know, the word crisis in Chinese is actually two words, and part of that is danger and opportunity. So again, let's concentrate on the positive stuff about crisis, not always look at it as a negative aspect, because it always be something that we can turn into a positive, especially for us in business, especially for us in marketing as well. Now, many CEOs do face the reality, and they do understand that many of them are not ready to deal with a crisis. Many companies know that. Some were better prepared than others, and it's happened to us in the educational level. We've seen how some universities and colleges were better prepared to deal with the issues that we're facing right now. But for the majority of companies, they're not ready. Part of it is a lack of a crisis management plan, lack of practicing, lack of rehearsing for potential situations that the company may face. In terms of the type of crisis that companies may face, we can look at industrial accidents, environmental problems, issues with public relations, hostile takeovers, acts of terrorism, and obviously a pandemic like we're facing right now can lead to that. There are four sources of crisis in business, and usually we have a percentage here that comes from operational issues, recalls, issues with the company in terms of quality, for instance, miscellaneous aspects, personal issues, and here we deal with things such as public relations due to incidents that maybe top management or CEOs face, such as Elon Musk, for instance. You guys know he's constantly having issues, personal issues that affect the image of the organization. And obviously we can have a part of it here that is institutional issues as well. What are the steps that usually take place when we have a crisis? Well, we always end up with begin with a phase one, and here's where we start seeing the warning signs of a potential crisis. Obviously, what we're facing right now is what we call a non-traditional crisis, a black swan event, in which is not something that we basically kind of prepare for. It's one of those events that happen every 100 years or so, but we still go through the whole process here, the crisis management stages. And stage two, we obviously start looking at acute crisis points for the organizations. This could be change in consumer behavior, change some practices related to how we do operational things within the organization, as well as how we do things dealing with our employees. In phase 3, now we start looking at the chronic crisis. And I have this little drawing right there of the coronavirus, because here's where most of us are in terms of the organization, in terms of businesses. We're now dealing with the chronic crisis stage, in which, of course, obviously, companies need to emphasize and do things to be able to deal with this. In phase 4, crisis resolution, we'll get there, guys. We'll get there eventually. Not there yet, but here is when we start basically seeing how things are going back to semi-normal, eventually normal, and obviously learning from that, we can implement different things. Again, as I mentioned, many companies, many CEOs, many organizations were not prepared for this, but the idea behind looking at post-crisis, crisis responding, pre-crisis is creating plans that will help us start coming up with prevention phases, crisis response phase, in which we can do a lot of things in terms of communication internally and externally, and post-crisis basically going back to business as usual. So that's the whole process that we can implement in terms of how we can manage the crisis. In terms of how we can manage a crisis, there are different aspects and instances here that we can do. So the first thing is to prepare. And like I mentioned, a high percentage of businesses are not prepared for a crisis, especially like the one we're facing right now. So part of that is developing emergency action plans that can help us set up training sessions to prepare for particular crisis that can happen, whether it's a pandemic or the type of crisis. During the crisis itself, what we do is respond to the crisis. And here what we try to do is minimize as much as we can damage to property, damage to obviously protect the life of our employees and consumers as much as we can. And that's what we're seeing right now that's happening. Many companies are in respond mode, mostly because governments have implemented laws and regulations to do so. After the crisis, definitely we're not here yet. We start looking at the recovery piece, in which we rebuild from that emergency, that crisis, in order to implement strategies that can help us mitigate, which is the next piece. And here we start looking at courses of actions to implement to prevent future crises, basically learning from the past issues that we face in the crisis. What is the idea behind this? Well, the idea behind this is that we can continue operating our business as we normally do, as much as we can, as closely as we can, because sometimes it's going to be impossible to continue doing things as we normally do, but we need to adapt and overcome and do it as closely as we can. And the crisis management aspect, obviously we're down here in the response and recovery piece. And one aspect that we looked at and is key in order to understand and create plans to deal with the crisis, organizational crisis, business crisis, is the piece of risk management, RM. And with risk management, obviously we try to find ways and analyze different things about the crisis that can help us basically mitigate and train for potential and events that can happen in the future. So with RM risk management, we're forecasting and we're looking at the evaluating financial risks in order to protect life, in order to protect infrastructure of the organization. With this piece, which is key in order to plan properly for a crisis, there are a lot of things that we look at, and we're constantly scanning our environment, we're constantly looking at that pestle analysis, we're constantly doing that SWOT analysis to understand things that may happen that affect our continuity of business. Obviously, a pandemic was probably not something that most organizations had in the risk management process, but I guarantee you that within the next few months, incidents like the one we're facing are going to be part of that risk management process and are going to be incorporated on things that the organization needs to look at and do. And part of that identification of risk, analyze that risk, and evaluate the risk, such as a pandemic and the things that the companies need to do. Obviously, all of this is to help us continue business as usual, right? And we analyze our hazards constantly. We assess the risk, the impact that risk is going to have in the business operations, the impact that risk is going to have on our employees, and the impact that risk is going to have on our consumers, long-term and short-term. Obviously, we manage and we measure those impacts in terms of the organization. And it's obviously each risk is going to be different for each organization. Think of the fact that right now, airlines, hotels, the service industry, the risk of what's happening for them is very high in terms of how the social distancing is impacting the things that they do. Again, we begin by identifying that particular risk, assess it, we rank it, we start looking for strategies to reduce the risk, strategies to implement communication plans that can help us alleviate and mitigate the process, the impact on the consumer and our employees. Obviously, we got to do a lot of training, simulation here, preparedness to deal with that crisis. And a lot of it comes from the external environment and what's happening outside the organization as well. In terms of risk assessment processes, organizations do this differently, but I'm giving you here a couple of examples of how organizations can rate different risks that can take place and affect their organizations. Most organizations do color charts. This could be part of a dashboard, for instance, in many organizations, and we can do the normal, the regular red, orange, and green colors in order to identify and rank the risks. Other organizations may do this by actually having a criteria of low, medium, high, and extreme. Obviously, a pandemic will probably be extreme for most organizations, and the likelihood of that happening is very low, but has a high impact on organizations and such, depending on the type of industries in which they are. Here's an example of a dashboard. And the idea here is, again, to identify those risks, come up with solutions, potential solutions for those risks, and categorize the impact that the risk is going to have in our organization. All of this to lead us to what we call a crisis management plan, a CMP, in which we can start looking at how we deal with some of the issues that we have. Also, assign personnel that can help us deal with some of the issues that we may face here on the actual risks, the likelihood of this happening, the impact, and the mitigation strategies that the organization may have in order to continue operations and continue developing what they're doing in terms of the organization. From here, you can download a couple of different crisis management plan templates that you can implement and use for your organization. Now, part of managing a crisis is communication. And internal communication is key. And here we worry about trying to control rumors that may affect the morale of our employees. Because with our employees, obviously, we cannot continue doing the normal thing or be as normal as we can in terms of business operations, in terms of delivering our products and services to our consumers. Obviously, we need to establish priority, and the first few hours of any crisis play a huge role in terms of how the rest of the crisis may play along, in terms of what we do in terms of the communication aspect. And obviously, we also need to manage expectations of our consumers, our stakeholders, suppliers, government officials, in terms of how the crisis is managed. Obviously, key here for any organization, if they don't do this properly, communication can make or break the reputation and the goodwill of their company if they don't respond quickly, if not. Obviously, most companies need to designate a spokesperson, whether it's the CEO, whether it's a communication specialist, a community manager that can help deal with the aspects of communication. And key for employees, internally speaking, talk about what you know. If the press comes to you and asks you questions, the idea here is that each employee still has a right to kind of talk about it, because we don't want to hide things, but talk about what you know. If you don't know, you don't know, and refer it to someone who may know, whether it's a spokesperson or management in that case. In terms of how we respond to a crisis, and we're seeing that right now. We're seeing it with many of the messages that companies are starting to send us. I'm going to give you several examples later of some of the examples that companies are doing in terms of effectively managing the crisis. And we need to be clear, right? We need to repeat the message. We need to stress what the company is doing. We need to do this honestly. And we got to show a lot of empathy. Keep in mind that many of our consumers are going through a lot of stressor factors right now. Many of our employees are going through a lot of stressor factors. Some of them may be out of work for a couple of months. Some of our normal consumers may be out of the work themselves, and that's going to affect, obviously, the type of consumer behavior practices that they had used in the past. And here we got to kind of provide an antidote to the fear. I'm not saying that companies in their communication strategy need to say that the virus is going away, but we need to show positive content, positive messages in our marketing communication campaign that will help with that antidote of fear to consumers. All crises have a cycle, a life cycle, just like the product life cycle, right? And here's that preparation piece that many companies ignore or don't do, and where I said many are not prepared. Obviously, there will be an emergency piece, and this is what many of us are dealing with right now in terms of our companies. And obviously, the crisis will dissipate, will pass, right? The problem with the crisis is that always takes us as individuals and as companies and organizations out of our comfort zone. It makes us kind of start thinking outside the box. It makes us start thinking about creative ideas to continue delivering the services and the processes that we do as a business. The good thing with the crisis, though, there's always a learning piece. We're always going to learn from that stress. We're always going to learn from what's happening in order to implement changes in organization. And we're seeing that right now. And some of the changes that we're seeing right now is with the communication piece of how companies and brands are delivering the message of, hey, everything is going to be all right. Things are going to be okay. We'll continue to be here for as long as we can. And here's some of the drivers that brands are using in order to do this. Well, obviously, as a brand, I need to kind of tailor my message to my stakeholders, my consumers. I need to continue showing a point of difference as to how I do things. And we're seeing companies coming up with very creative ways to do the things that they do right now. I need to continue providing value. Everything that we do in marketing is in terms of value, right? Creating value for the consumer, creating value for society, creating value for the organization. And so we need to continue showing that. We need to ensure that the products and services that we have are conveniently delivered to consumers. And we're seeing how many companies are finding creative ways to continue delivering and have accessibility to their products and services to consumers. And lastly, and here's where I'm going to concentrate for the rest of the webinar, is develop and create that emotional connection with our consumers. And let's not forget about our employees, right? Cannot do this without our employees, with our internal stakeholders and internal staff, right? Develop that emotional connection. Develop that in a way in which the consumer feels connected with our brand. How do we do this? You may ask. Well, then we start getting here into what we call emotional branding. And here's basically developing a communication campaign that appeals to consumer in an emotional, inspirational aspect. Obviously, right now, consumers are dealing with a lot of stress. Our employees are dealing with a lot of stress, and we need to get consumers and employees to fall in love with our brands, right? Even in times of pandemic, even in times of crisis. We need to continue developing that brand loyalty and continue to having consumers have the trust on our brands as we deal with the current crisis. Now, so in terms of this, obviously the first thing I need to do is catch the attention of my consumers. This is normal communication stuff that we do every day, but now we're going to do this with a little bit of more emotional attachment so that our consumers see that we're trying to deal with what's happening in terms of the crisis. We deal here with the basic emotions of our consumers. And what do you think is probably happening to our consumers right now? Many of our consumers are probably going through the emotion of sadness. Many of them are probably fearful. Many of us are probably angry because this freaking coronavirus screwed up all our 2020 and our plans that we have for this year, right? Many people are probably surprised. So there are a lot of things in here that are playing and taking the toll on our consumers as well. The attention aspect is important here. And we do this with a creative marketing communication campaigns that can catch the attention of our consumers. Obviously, the attention span has diminished in the last few years. How do we get this attention piece? Well, we start doing this by the senses of our consumers, looking at different things in terms of our marketing campaigns. Right now, because we're staying home, most of us, a lot of our communication campaigns are mostly done by TV, radio, and internet, right? In order to be able to capture that aspect of the consumer. I need to start developing that sensory memory of the consumer, that short-term memory aspect through my sensorial communication campaigns. From that working memory, obviously, I want the consumer to remember my brand, and that is playing the role with the long-term memory. That in itself helps the consumer make the decision in the long term, obviously, to select my brand. Now, important here, I want my consumers that remember what I'm doing as a brand, as a company, in these times of crisis, because that's going to have an emotional attachment for that consumer that in the long term, in terms of memory, they will remember what we're doing right now as a brand in the future. And when we go back to normal, hopefully that consumer remembers that and continues to select my brand. So now let's look at a couple of communication adjustments the brands have been doing in the last few years, in the last few months rather, to deal with the current crisis and to generate and create that emotional aspect that I'm mentioning here, so that consumers can actually remember who I am in the future as well. So we see here a couple of examples from Google, for instance, implementing the social distancing piece. McDonald's, also with their famous arches separated. Coca-Cola has also done the same thing with the logo, right? Companies like Nike with the ISO logo here, doing the opposite, right? Not that just do it, but just don't do it. In the opposite, in the case of not going outside, MasterCard again, social distancing. Companies developing products in here that can protect our children. We've seen a lot of companies adjusting the logos as well here with the masks in order to be able to show that we are doing something, that we've kind of encouraging people to protect themselves. That connection right there, that emotional connection with our consumers. Obviously, we have here stay at home, right? So Wendy went home. The Colonel is not there either. The Little Mermaid of Starbucks is gone. And the child is always hanging from the DreamWorks moon went home as well, right? So that's the idea. Again, social distancing here. And a couple of examples from around the world in terms of Europe here. We're starting to see a lot of brands doing the same. IKEA, for instance, right? This is IKEA's stay-at-home kit. Your keys, door, and your toilet paper, right? As an example of staying at home. This is a Latin American branding here in which the logo has changed from the normal handshake to the new handshake or elbow shake that we're all doing around the world. Again, Nissan here with a couple of emotional messages that help you kind of connect with the brand in terms of what's happening. And even the government is doing the same thing. So here's the national parks from Australia with their kangaroo here saying, hey, you need to stay away, right? And koalas as well. And obviously in the food industry, we've seen a lot of changes in a lot of companies, even though the food industry is kind of still going in many places of the world, they also had to adapt to what's happening here. So we can see here a good example of Burger King, which I worked for the company for several years, and they implemented here the crown and that they always give the children when they come into the store here with the social distancing. They're giving people here examples of create their own Whopper at home, right? That's just stay at home, and different other products that the company actually sells. And other things that are happening that's pretty cool in the last few months is what we call referral marketing campaigns. And since a lot of us are staying home, we're referring people to services that others are providing from home. And Airbnb as a way to kind of deal with the situation in terms of what's happening to the company in terms of people not going to places, has launched a new product, a new service called Online Experiences, where people share their activities from their house. And they basically can buy activities from other consumers as they do them from their house. Another thing that's happening a lot with referral marketing, and here we get also engaged on the emotional piece of the consumer, is companies giving special offers to consumers who buy from home and refer other friends, or consumers are actually being able to provide discounts, or companies are providing discounts to first responders as all the consumers buy. So first responders, cops, nurses, they're all in the front lines of what's happening. So it's also a way to support and create that emotional attachment with them. Here we have some examples also of companies doing the referral campaigns. As you stay at home, refer a friend, obviously you get a discount. And I'm going to show you here a quick video from IKEA. Let's see if I can display that. And this is their campaign for stay at home. This commercial was shot for the Spaniard market. So it's all about bringing and showing the issues that we're dealing with at home, right? Staying at home, family. And they got a couple of cool ones too in regards to creating the gym at home, for instance. Now, to finish up everything and to wrap it up, I'm going to wrap it up in five steps. So we need to develop and create effective crisis management communication campaigns and plans that can help us do the following in order to develop that emotional connection with our consumers, in order to create that sense that we're actually helping and we're doing something to kind of help us deal with what's happening. So one, we need to present our message with empathy and transparency. And here's one issue that we're starting to see with some companies. Some consumers are starting to kind of think that many companies are taking advantage of the crisis to do and set up their communication campaigns, but not really doing anything to help consumers. Well, obviously, that's the idea. Empathy and transparency. Well, not just talk about it, but do something about it. So we're starting to see how some banks around the world are actually helping consumers with overdraft fees for now. We've seen some banks that are actually suspending the automatic payment system in terms of collecting the debt so that consumers can actually pay as they can. And that's one aspect that shows a little bit of that transparency for consumers. Shows humility from the company as well. Two, we need to find ways to communicate in a more agile way that we normally do. Many companies are doing this by implementing very cool videos, very short videos that kind of help us deal with the situation and talk about it. So Nike has developed this incredible marketing campaign about playing inside and play with the world. It's all about staying at home, but do it in a safe manner, right? And obviously, can't never forget about the athletes. It's part of the always going to be part. But here, what the cool thing is, they take in athletes and they take in people who are home, normal people doing their everyday stuff at home, to continue creating that sense of emotional connection with the brand, right? So whether you're doing sports in your basement, in the hallway, in the stairs of your home, right? The idea is that we do this together and we stay at home as long as we can in order to help out with the current crisis situation that we're facing. And how many of you have developed your home gym in the last few weeks with whatever you can in order to stay in shape?
Thank you, Álvaro, for your presentation.
Running out of time? Got two more.
You have? Sorry. I thought that you were wrapping up. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. Give me 5 more minutes, and we'll finish up here because I got 3 more steps in here. All right. We need to associate our brand with good. Associate what we're doing with a local charity or a local paid social media campaign aspect here, and we can see brands such as Adobe, which has donated the Adobe Cloud Creative Cloud program and has made it available for K-12 institutions, for high schools, kindergarten from all the way through high schools around the U.S. as a way to also show some goodness here. Brownie paper company has launched a local heroes campaign in the U.S. By basically donating Brownie products and giving out food as well in some markets that are facing the coronavirus aspect. We also need to be able to track trends and build scenarios. Start thinking about how consumers in the last few months have changed their buying behavior and their buying patterns, and basically start adapting to that. Create real-time insights in here from a lot of the social media platforms, for instance. Think about the fact that most of us are moving from the traditional retail to mostly e-commerce. So find creative ways in here to do this, and obviously do this in a way in which we can track information from our consumers. And lastly, we need to adapt to the new ways of working. Guys, this is not going to change tomorrow. This is not going to change in the next 2 months. We may be dealing with this on and off for at least 6 months to a year. So as a company, as an organization, we need to adapt. And here's an example of a company in Colombia that has adapted some of the delivery processes. And basically, you can do a lot of your shopping online. Walmart has done the same thing in the US. Do a lot of your shopping online, and you come into an area of the parking lot, and where obviously it's social distancing, they'll bring the stuff to you, pay, and you go home, or pick up your stuff if you already pay by credit card. New reality, a lot of us are going to continue to work from home. A lot of us are going to continue to study from home. So we need to adapt to that as well. And for some retailers, that new reality may involve investing a lot of money on bio-developed products and services. And here, like here, for instance, the spraying action to try to eliminate the fact of the virus. So this is what's going to happen. It's not changing, and basically part of that is dealing with those changes. To close and to wrap everything up, as a company, in order to be able to deal with the crisis, in order to be able to not only implement my crisis management plan and do the response and the mitigation piece and everything I discussed in terms of marketing, I need to develop feel-good content for my consumers, feel-good content also for my employees, for my internal stakeholders, messages that show positivism, messages that show the aspect that many of us are home, that many of us are now sharing different experiences. For some of us negative, for some of us okay, for some of us positive. But that's the idea behind this. And do this, obviously, with authenticity and a true purpose, right? That wraps up my webinar. I thank you all for your time and for being tuned to learn a little bit about crisis management response and how brands are basically adapting to the new reality in terms of creating their communication processes in order to, and also ways to deal and perform their continuity of operations or continuity of business to continue doing what they do normally for consumers and also for their employees. Thank you. Not sure if
Thank you for your presentation. It's really important because you identify key factors for to face crisis management, and we are receiving a lot of questions, so I will go ahead and ask you some of them. The first one is from Professor Agostino, and he's asking, Professor is talking about the digital panorama. Will the artificial intelligence take more ground in the way marketing has been done until today?
Artificial intelligence is basically, in my opinion, a tool that we can continue to use to reach our consumers. But in terms of what's happening, yes, as artificial intelligence is going to help us to be able to continue delivering the services and goods that we have for our consumers. But at the end of the day, Professor, what I think, because of the emotional impact that we're seeing, that human piece is and will continue to be key in order to develop that emotional attachment with our consumers, in order to be able to deliver the appropriate message. Yes, artificial intelligence is great in order for the processes that we do in terms of getting our products and services to consumers, but the human piece to deal with the crisis, to be able to communicate what's happening in a better way, computers will not be able to do that. That's the aspect of management, that's the aspect of employees, and how we train our employees to be able to deliver that message to our consumers as a whole.
Thank you. Professor Tanya Chica is asking us how to overcome resistance and effectively implement change.
Okay, cool. So, like I mentioned in one of the slides, the idea as far as resistance, it's always going to happen. We're always going to have people who are going to resist to changes. But one of the things that I always try to highlight is to involve everyone that is part of that change process, whether it's my employees, whether it's my consumer. And we've seen it with the consumers. Many companies are now doing a lot of content that is shared by the consumers more so than the company itself. And it's all about getting everyone involved with that change process. Obviously, regulations are going to mandate how we do things in terms of the coronavirus based on the different countries in which the virus is basically taking a toll on consumers, employees, and society as a whole.
So another anonymous professor is asking us, sometimes organization persists in keeping some information in the higher levels. Talking about internal communication, do you think it's better to have better informed employees? Don't you think it can be counterproductive sometimes?
No. I think that communication at all levels of a crisis is key. Helps to eliminate rumors, because what's going to happen if the employees don't get enough information? Guess what, Prof? They're going to make up their own information, and some of that information could be gossip, could be information that may be erroneous, And the problem here is that those employees may end up actually passing the wrong information to our consumers as well. So no, I think that the more we communicate with employees, the better we're able to manage the risk, the crisis, the better we're able to control rumors and control the anxiety that our employees are facing. Let's take into account that right now with the crisis, many companies have to shut down their doors and kind of talking to the employees about what's happening also helps them prepare better themselves for the crisis as well. And the last thing I want to do is not communicate to my employees, having this become a public relation issue eventually, because with social media, a lot of stuff basically get leaked and it's easy to be found somewhere else. So I'd rather nip it in the bud, talk to my employees, keep the information channel two-way, obviously, because this is also going to reflect positively on the goodwill and the image of the brand in terms of my consumers.
We have two more questions. So they're asking you any advice on how to identify stakeholders and key partners to implement the crisis management strategy?
Okay, so crisis management strategy, you need to start within the organization, obviously. I recommend that every department has a piece on the crisis management plan, meaning my human resources director or human resources management's got to be in that plan. IT, I cannot do a lot of the things in crisis management preparedness if I don't have technology involved in this. Operations, top management, there's got to be what we call a crisis management team, a CMT. And basically, I'm taking a cross-functional team from different areas of the organization in order to be able to develop that crisis management plan. Why? Because they also bring their own expertise. I know marketing, I know human resources, but I know nothing about operations or logistics, for lack of a better word. They know their piece. And the idea here is that I'm finding ways to continue operations. And part of that continuity of operations is having those different departments kind of help us with their ideas, their mitigation plans, and also do a lot of preparedness. As I mentioned, many organizations were not prepared for this. This is a 100-year event, a Black Swan event, but there are the events that are crises that we could deal with. And many companies are just not ready to deal with some of those issues. But bring different stakeholders. Obviously, in terms of your external stakeholders, you as a company know which ones are more important to you. My suppliers, for instance, Apple has been working with suppliers for a while with this issue, and they know who are the main key suppliers that they need to in order to continue the operations. My distributors also, in terms of a retailer, for instance, so I need to be able to work with them. If I can, involve them also in some of the planning and exercise or training activities of the crisis. And obviously also one of the stakeholders are going to dictate a lot of the things we do as the government, as far as the regulations that depending on the industry in which I'm in.
So the last question to wrap it up, I just left Alvaro's email in our chat in case you need further information or inquiries. Please feel free to write to Professor Álvaro.
By all means.
And the last question is how to face managing shipping priorities and strategies with the companies. This is a major challenge within the companies.
Are they referring to shipping logistics aspects, or can you repeat the question?
How to face managing shifting priorities and strategies with the companies. Okay. This is a major challenge within the companies.
Yeah, definitely. And as I mentioned in the presentation, crisis in itself is an opportunity for many new business opportunities, for new implementation of processes. Shifting changes are all going to be part of that issue of managing a crisis. Again, prioritize, and remember that when I'm talking about crisis management, what I'm trying to do at the end of the day is minimize life factors, minimize people losing their lives, being my employees, my consumers as they come into my organization or my retail location, etc., and also manage or mitigate the impact to infrastructure. So you have to take into account those in order to be able to manage those shifts or changes. Obviously, loss of life, key. The example I give you of BP, and which that oil platform exploded and about 6 or 7 of the employees lost their lives, that became a changing factor for how they implemented many of the strategies after that in order to manage those platforms. And the same thing we got to be thinking about it. Obviously, there's also a cost involved with this. And as I mentioned, this is the new reality. We got to start thinking ahead of what's going to happen as the government allows us to reopen some of the normal operations that we do. And we're seeing it. Many shopping malls are now investing a lot of money on scanner technology. They can see that your temperatures you come in. They train the employees with to deal with these aspects. So it's a matter of prioritizing. In my opinion, continue to keep life as the one aspect that's important here, and also the fact that you also want to manage infrastructure related issues that can impact your operation. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to continue operations.